This is They Create Worlds, episode 233, Baldur's Gate.
If anybody wants to find me, I'll be in the last place you would look. In a place where people used to be, a land that's called reality. You'll find me there.
Welcome to They Create Worlds. I'm Jeffrey, and I'm joined by my co-host, Alex.
Hello.
Yes, I see Boo bravely returning. He is back with some sort of charge that we can put at this gate in order to explode it open, because all the nice listeners at home and their Pong games are not getting us through this gate. So obviously Boo and his shaped charge is going to do the trick.
Well, then what are you waiting for? Go for the eyes, Jeffrey! Go for the eyes!
I must gather my party before venturing forth.
That's right, we are finally ready to talk about Baldur's Gate due to a combination of IRL busyness and needing to dig a little deeper into a few sources to get the research done. We did have to push off our look at Baldur's Gate by one episode. Did a little bit of a Pong episode in between, but we now have the sources, we now have the time, we now have the party, so we are ready to look at the RPG that is credited with saving the Western RPG. We'll dig a little deeper into that claim as we go, but still an incredibly important milestone of a game in Baldur's Gate.
So we're looking specifically at the game itself. We're not looking at the company at large. We're not looking at specific setups here. It's really a deep dive at the first game, not the second game or the third game.
No, it's really a look at the first game and a little bit of the early history of BioWare, just because these two things are kind of inextricably linked to each other. But I want to delve into, and it's not about a deep dive into every last character or location or plot point or that kind of thing. I really want to delve into the why this game was so important, why it's considered the game that saved Western RPGs, whether that's a completely fair thing to say about it or not, because the way this game was approached was just very different than the RPGs that had come before, in part because of changing technology and changing operating systems. It was one of the very first games to take advantage of kind of the new ways that you could make 2D games in the 1990s. I think that's really what set it apart from everything else. And so that's really what we want to focus on. I mean, we're going to talk a little bit about the creation of the game, the influences of the game, but also just where it fits in RPG history and why it was such a leap forward and such a breath of fresh air when it came out in 1998.
What was the climate? Because you said that it's credited as potentially being the one to save Western RPGs. We know back in the day, a lot of Western RPGs is what inspired the Eastern RPGs. All the stuff coming out with our Dragon Quest, our Final Fantasies, so on and so forth. Why would you say, because we have Western RPGs that were popular even into the 90s and early 2000s, what made people think that the Western RPG was dying, and how does BioWare and Baldur's Gate really save that situation?
At this time, there weren't RPGs coming out very much at the time that Baldur's Gate was released. There was a real gap between there's only a gap that in real time was about 2 or 3 years, which is insignificant today, but in the fast-moving world of video games, especially at that time, that was a very huge gap where it looked like the entire industry was falling apart. It was really due to the changes in the ecosystem at the time. In the early 1990s, you had a sudden surge in the popularity of fast-paced, action-based, real-time games with more advanced graphics, speedier gameplay, and visceral action. Wolfenstein and Doom are obviously two of the big ones here, but even games like Wing Commander, which was not a first-person shooter in that vein, were taking the industry in this bigger, more cinematic direction. This was making it harder for turn-based, more clunky games to find a place in the world. you still had certain turn-based games that were popular in the strategy space, like your XComs or your Civilizations. But when it came to controlling characters and taking them through a story, this new paradigm was taking over. This required a major reset on the part of the RPG companies. They had to think about what an RPG was going to look like in this time period. They had never really banked heavily on their graphics, per se. They definitely banked more on their intricate systems, their intricate combat systems, their exploration. In the case of Ultima, the dialogue trees that you used to uncover what was going on in the world. That mode of gameplay was just beginning to fall a little bit out of favor in the United States in the early 1990s. Also, you had the move in this time period from the older systems like the Commodore 64 and the Apple II into this IBM PC space that in 1987 had been supercharged by the arrival of the VGA graphics standard, which allowed for still not, incredible graphics based on what we would think of them today, but huge leaps forward from the CGA and EGA 4-color and 16-color standards that the PC had been used to up to that point. VGA could display graphics to the tune of 320 by 200 or 320 by 240 with a whopping 256 colors.
Back in the day, that was considered really, really good. I remember as a kid, and I think you might have too, looking at Warcraft 2, which took advantage of this, and being like, how could video games get more pretty?
Indeed. There was a need to shift to the PC, and there was a need to shift to graphics that were a bit more sophisticated than the graphics back in the day. Still not ridiculously sophisticated, but more sophisticated than had been the case on the 8-bit systems. We're moving into this fully 16-bit world. RPGs had always been kind of these small passion projects from these boutique houses for the most part. I mean, many of them have been very popular and amongst the most popular games on PCs at various times, but when you think of Ultima, it was almost entirely Richard Garriott. It is relatively small company origin. We talked about Wizardry, Surtech, another very small company. We haven't really done Might and Magic very much on the podcast yet, but that's another one where the creator, John Van Kingem, wrote the first game in the series all by himself over the course of like 3 years, and his company, New World Computing, remained a relatively small company at the beginning of the 1990s. Even companies that were a little larger, like Interplay and SSI, were still relatively small companies, SSI still being very much a family company run by Joel Billings that created some great games, particularly the Gold Box series, but they were relatively small outfits still. In this new era of 16-bit machines and better graphics, and as sound cards come along, better sound and all of this kind of thing, you're talking about having to expand to bigger teams to do some of the same stuff. So there was a crossroads here where the technology was changing and the player tastes were changing as the RTSs and the first-person shooters and even cinematic games like Wing Commander were coming in, or even the ridiculous Sillywood games. Like, the entire market was changing. These companies were trying to figure out where their games should live within this new market, and for the most part, it wasn't coming together. They were trying to build new, more advanced engines that just were bug-ridden and led to unplayable games, which is what happened to SSI's later games in their Dungeons & Dragons series, or they were trying to introduce more action-based elements, as was the case with Richard Garriott in Ultima 8, which we talked about being such a big problem. These series were just kind of falling by the wayside. They were unable to evolve, and they were crashing into bug-ridden messes that were just getting completely overshadowed by this new wave of fast action games. In the period between 1994 and 1997, very little came out in the United States that would have been categorized at the time as a role-playing game. Now, obviously, Diablo comes out at the tail end of 96, beginning of 97, but Diablo wasn't considered an RPG at the time. It very clearly is, but people really did think of Ultima and Wizardry and Bard's Tale and the Gold Box games. That's what they thought of as RPGs.
Diablo was an action thing with some RPG elements.
Right. Now, in Europe, the situation was a little bit different. There were a couple of RPG series going on over there. Basically, there was a landmark game that came out in 1987 in the United States, Dungeon Master, that pioneered a form of first-person, pseudo-real-time, step-based RPGs that the British would, many, many years later, like in the 2000s, would later term blobbers, because you would control a whole party of characters, but none of them would appear on the screen. So you were just running around from the perspective of this blob of characters or something. I don't know the exact origin of the term. But these kind of games were having some success in Europe in this time period. But funnily enough, even though it was all inspired by an American game, Dungeon Master was never particularly successful in the United States because it had come out on the Atari ST. And then the Amiga was not a PC game. It just completely fell by the wayside there and got a little popular in Europe because those computers were more popular there. There was kind of an RPG tradition still going on in Europe a little bit, but in general, RPGs were not as popular in Europe as they were in the United States. And none of these games that were having success in Europe were really, in most cases, not even coming to the United States. But even if they did, were not selling in huge quantities in the United States. Even with some of that blobber stuff going on at this time, it really was a fallow period for the RPG. And the real problem was, how do you make an RPG that's technically good enough, that has a solid engine, that has solid mechanics, that is pretty enough and has all of that graphical stuff going on, and also appeals to a more modern audience that is getting used to these real-time games, while still not losing the core RPG audience that still craves all of that heavy crunch underneath their role-playing experience. Truly, BioWare was the company that solved all these issues. Again, they may not have been the first to do every last thing, but we don't care about first most of the time at They Create Worlds unless we're doing a specific deep dive on something like that. We're looking at popularizer. Baldur's Gate is what really brought this stuff back. There were a couple of RPGs that were starting to pave the way before that. Diablo, which we would recognize as an RPG today, is one of those, but of course it's far more action-based. It doesn't have that same crunch as a traditional RPG, and it doesn't have plot and character interaction and some of those other things that we think of when we think of RPGs. Fallout, which we've covered on the show as well, is another one that was kind of starting to bring this back, but it was kind of a compromise between old school RPGs and kind of isometric strategy games in the vein of an XCOM or a Crusader No Remorse, where it was an RPG and it had some of that deeper feel with its special system, but its combat felt a little more like a strategy game than a full-on RPG. So that's not to dismiss any of these games, because Fallout was certainly another sign that perhaps the RPG was about to emerge from its slumber. But even the original Fallout had nothing on the impact of Baldur's Gate when it arrived a year later.
So who do we blame for coming up with the concept of Baldur's Gate? Why Baldur's Gate? Why use Dungeons and Dragons as sort of a baseline to it? At least, if not fully, the mechanical system, the universe of the Forgotten Realms, and using that for a setting. You got to get licensing for that.
Yes. None of it started there. None of it started with the idea of D&D. The beginning of the game is completely enmeshed in the beginning of the company itself, BioWare, which is why I do want to take just a moment to go into a little bit of the history. This isn't an episode on the history of BioWare, but we have to have a little bit of that context. BioWare was founded by 3 doctors from Alberta, Canada. Ray Mazuka, Greg Zeshik, and Augustine Yip. These three guys had gone to medical school together in Edmonton, in Alberta. All three of them were avid game players. They found there to be a great contrast between the games that they played for fun and the medical software that was used in some of their classes, educational stuff, which was very primitive and kind of terrible.
Kind of odd to think of doctors having video games that are educational for them to learn things. You would think that all the educational games are focused more on grade schools or preschool students.
We're not talking about games here. We're not talking about educational games. We're talking about educational software, simulators that allow you to interact with virtual patients or virtual x-rays or virtual lab results and use them to interpret and to diagnose. So we're not talking about edutainment here. We're just talking about purely educational software that is not trying to be a game. And it wasn't that they were particularly interested in gamifying medical software, but it's just that they found that it was the interfaces were primitive, the graphics were primitive, like everything about them was pretty primitive compared to what they were seeing in games. They wanted more sophisticated programs. They weren't necessarily looking to gamify what was going on in that space. Flash forward a few years after they graduated from medical school, and they're all practicing medicine in the Edmonton area. They kind of held on to all of these problems that they had with the software from medical school, which was basically that it was slow, had little to no graphical elements, and had very bad interfaces. All things that games had solved. Like, they didn't need it to be fun, but they played games that, worked well and played quickly and had pretty graphics and had nice interfaces. And it's like, why can't we have these nice things in medical software?
That's because a lot of those kind of software are designed by engineers who are trying to just get the functionality done. They don't spend time thinking, the user who's using this, what would be the flow that they are doing in order to do this? Maybe I should focus buttons that they're going to use the most over here. Maybe I should have some keyboard shortcuts to go with those buttons. Stuff that's not used much, I might have it hide away or be able to be turned off to cut down on visual noise that's on the interface. It's something that happens a lot with software that is developed by technical people that ends up being used by not so technical people. It's not an easy thing to solve. You actually need to have a dedicated person there who's going like, okay, what's the user interface for this software need to be? How are people going to interact with this? And we need to iterate on that. That's a whole big thing unto itself, let alone just figuring out the technical challenges of just getting the software to do what you want it to do.
Absolutely. That often can still be a problem today, of course, but UX design is a recognized field now. I don't know that UX design was really a recognized field in the 1980s and 1990s. People just were not thinking about software in those terms. All three of the doctors were self-taught programmers. They weren't brilliant programmers. They weren't really ever going to make a living out of being programmers, but they were all game players. They were all self-taught programmers. They're all doctors, so they're pretty smart. So they decided to get together and create some medical software that would just be better than what they had used in school, that would have better interfaces, that would run a little faster, that would have some graphics to them. Nothing fancy and not games, but just something that worked a little better. So they created two pieces of medical software: Acid Base Simulator and Gastroenterology Patient Simulator.
I'm starting to see where the whole bio in BioWare came from.
Yeah, though, yes and no. People often assume that the name came because of this early stuff, but there actually is a complete break between the medical software they were doing and creating a games company. Like, the company did not exist yet when they were making these early things. So the acid-base simulator, they gave, I don't know if they bought it or just gave it to them, at the University of Alberta, which is where they had all gone to school. The gastroenterology patient simulator was actually sold through a pharmaceutical company. Like, they didn't have their own company. They just made this thing, and then they gave it to a pharmaceutical company in Canada, and that company sold it. This gave them the confidence to think that they actually could perhaps make a go of it in computer software, but their true love was games. It's great that they were doing this kind of stuff, but what they were really interested in was games. So it was after this that they decided to found a game company. So in 1995, they formed BioWare, which was called that because they were doctors. That was kind of the joke there. It wasn't because of this medical software, because according to the founders themselves, because the medical software had nothing to do with the company being formed, other than the fact that it gave them the confidence to think that they could succeed. But the medical programs were not created by BioWare. They founded this as a part-time venture. They were all going to keep practicing medicine, and indeed, very quickly, Augustine Yip decided that really he wanted to keep practicing medicine, and he actually backed out of the company very quickly. Really, the company was shaped by Ray Mazuka and Greg Zeshik, with Yip leaving very, very quickly. They continued to work as doctors for some time after founding the company in 1995. Indeed, Greg continued to work as a doctor until 1999, far after BioWare was successful, because he enjoyed being a doctor too, but finally it got to the point where that was not feasible. They founded BioWare in 1995, and near as I can tell from the very beginning, their ambition was to create some kind of role-playing game. Though, of course, that is not the first game that was released. The first game that they did was a mech game called Shattered Steel. The reason for that is they inherited this game from some of their first hires, because they were self-taught programmers and all, but they were not the greatest programmers, and they were not game designers. Like, they wanted to get involved in this, but they knew that they couldn't do this all by themselves. They needed people. They needed to hire up quickly. This isn't going to be one of these situations like some of the other companies that we've talked about, like Condor or Insomniac or whatnot, that are forming in this period, where it's like a couple of really great programmers are like, let's found a company together and make games together, and then they make a game. It's like, no, these guys needed help from the beginning. They weren't people that could just do this all by themselves. Turns out that Greg's cousin Marcel Zeshik was working with a couple of his friends by the name of Trent and Brent Oster, they were brothers, at a small startup that they had created themselves called Pyrotech. Pyrotech with a K at the end. These three had spent some time making a kind of 3D version of asteroids that they called Blasteroids 3D. The doctors kind of got a look at that and thought that it looked kind of cool, and so offered to publish their next product through BioWare. So they weren't hired into BioWare right away, though they would be eventually. BioWare said they'd publish their next game, and the next game that they were working on was a mech game. So that was their first game, Shattered Steel. It didn't do that great. They were a smaller company. There's only so much they could do with it, and the King of the Hill at this time, which we talked about in some of our Bobby Kotick Activision episodes, was the Activision game MechWarrior 2, which released a major expansion at about the same time Shattered Steel came out. So that was kind of that. But the important thing about it is they did form a relationship with the publisher Interplay through that game, because Interplay was the company that ended up publishing it. More on them in just a little bit. Shattered Steel was the first game that came out because they were working with these guys and it was already in development. But the game that they were really wanting to make themselves was a sort of RPG, but it wasn't the RPG that ended up being Baldur's Gate. It wasn't that kind of game. The game that they were thinking about was a game called Battleground Infinity. This was going to be an RPG, but it was going to be a multiplayer kind of online RPG, almost an MMO, but they weren't talking about making a game of the same scale as an MMO. Battleground Infinity was going to take place in this kind of Ragnarokish world of gods where all of the ancient pantheons, the Norse, the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, all of them were duking it out in this kind of Ragnarok-style last battle. You would choose your faction, and you would join that faction of gods, and you would create the character, and you would battle other characters and level up and ascend through the ranks of said pantheon. That was the game they were working on, Battleground Infinity, which is why, of course, the engine they were creating to power this game was known as the Infinity Engine.
That makes sense.
Indeed, which of course is the engine that would power Baldur's Gate, and several of the games that followed Baldur's Gate was the Infinity Engine, and that's the reason why. In order to build this thing, this engine, they hired their first internal person besides the founders, a programmer by the name of Scott Greig, I think. Greig. It's spelled Greig. So Greig or Greg, I'm not sure. But this is the guy they hired. At this time, the company was just moving out of the basement. It literally started in Greg Zeshik's basement, and they were in that basement for like about 6 months. In the beginning of 1996, they moved to a new location, a tiny office upstairs from a bicycle shop. Kind of their first real office at the same time that Scott was coming in. Scott was another one of these fortuitous encounters, just like the people at Pyrotech. Scott was a database programmer, not a games programmer, but he liked games. He thought games were cool. And his father was friends with the doctors, which is what the founders of BioWare were often called. They were called the doctors because they were real. They were real doctors with a PhD and making video games, except not really. He's a real doctor.
Bonus points if you get that reference.
So he was like, okay, that sounds kind of cool. So he went and met them when they were still in the basement, and they talked. And he was like, okay, this seems kind of cool. I'll come over here. And, he had a pretty good job at the time. Database programming is not sexy, but boy, is it good, steady income. So he had a good job already, but he thought this game thing seemed kind of cool. So he decided to come over, and he started work on this engine. Now we need to take a break here in kind of talking about the progression here to talk about the way that computer graphics were changing at this time, because this is very central to the Baldur's Gate story. As I said, in 1987, there had been the promulgation of the VGA graphics standard that allowed those fancy high-res 320 by 200 or 320 by 240 graphics with a whole 256 colors. That was exactly 256 colors because the palette was also 256 colors. It wasn't meant... I'm sure people probably came up with ways to do palette swapping, but it wasn't natively meant to do palette swapping. 256 colors is what you got.
Who would possibly want more?
Right. Of course, at this time, we're still talking about games primarily being done in DOS. So you had your 640K of memory. It was partitioned out kind of weirdly. Virtual memory wasn't really a thing. It was very clunky making games in this environment, which is the challenge that so many of these RPG companies were running into as they were trying to expand their engines. Memory was limited or hard to access or both because it was all being done in DOS. VGA graphics had some advantages over earlier graphics, but they were slow. You could not do page flipping in the VGA standard, which means basically that you're always drawing two screens at once. You're drawing the current screen and you're drawing the next screen, and then you flip between them so that the graphics are faster because you've always got the next one ready to go and you're putting it in right away. The memory wasn't really optimized. The video memory structure wasn't really optimized for games. VGA graphics were better than what had come before on the PC, but they were slow and they were clunky. DOS was clunky and memory was clunky and everything was clunky and terrible. And that's why you were starting to have these problems. Like, so many of the games of this time period, I mean, we talked about the Doom guys and this and that. We talked about why the id guys were so successful is that, frankly, John Carmack was a genius. And John Romero, while not quite the same programming genius as Carmack, was almost as big a genius in other ways as Carmack. It took geniuses to get the most out of these things. It took these hacker types that knew these systems backwards and forwards, could get in and break them and use them in ways nobody thought you were supposed to be able to make games. The focus oftentimes was just getting these darn things to work. Like, you spent so much of your time figuring out just how to make your game run the way you wanted it to, that there wasn't a lot of time left over to create expansive worlds, which is part of what RPGs were running into as an obstacle. Now, that doesn't matter with something like Doom. Doom benefited from brilliant level design. There's lots of brilliance in Doom, but Doom didn't need to be something big and expansive with all sorts of systems layered on top of each other and a living world for the player to interact with. Doom is just like, demons coming right for you, shoot them in the head. You don't need to load that shit. We already did that for you. Shoot them in the head.
You don't even really need to do that. We got most of that aiming done for you. Just point in the general direction and we'll hit it.
Exactly. Another reason why that kind of game was taking over, in addition to the fact that the public just found them fun and a breath of fresh air, and more people like fast adrenaline-based games than like slow strategy games. That's just a fact. I like slow strategy games. I'm not dissing on them. It's just the majority of the people in the world are adrenaline junkies, not strategy junkies. You know, in addition to that problem there, I think this is another problem that they were hitting, is it was just hard to execute in those systems at a high level and also create something big and expansive. These games would break because they're trying to create these engines that can do all of this stuff, and then it just doesn't hold up under the weight of everything. That had been the state of things, but now the state of things is changing. The first thing that's changing at this point is there's a new graphical system in town called Super VGA, or SVGA. SVGA has some advantages over VGA. Instead of being restricted to that 320 by 200 or 240 resolution with 256 colors, you can get yourself a baseline of 640 by 400 or 640 by 480. With those 256 colors, so you're kind of getting to the point where you can display what your standard raster television displays.
Yay! We have achieved television.
Hooray. But the other thing is that it also allows for higher resolutions with greater color depth. It kind of pushes the standard more towards 800 by 600, and then also has the possibility of 1024 by 768, and even 1280 by 1024 if you're being extra special fancy. And with 24-bit color depth instead of just 256 colors, which means you can have many of the colors.
Enough that we stop being able to name them and we just start adding numbers.
Exactly. At maximum, we're talking 16,777,216 color variations, which is more than the human eye can actually pick up. We clock out at about 10 million.
So we're good.
So this was a huge leap forward, but there are a couple of problems with it. First of all, as all of those fancy resolutions and color depths indicate, you're going to need a whole lot more memory for this. So it's not like everyone at the moment SVGA systems are first promulgated in the late 1980s that everyone's going to be able to rush and actually make use of all of that power. The potential's there, but you don't really have all of that power. But the bigger problem, even than that, is that you've noticed that I have deliberately avoided using the word standard, as I did with the VGA standard. Because there was no such thing as an SVGA standard.
Why?
Well,
you're going to offer this thing, give me all the colors, get me some nice, decent resolutions, and you're saying it's not a standard?
No, and I don't know the exact reason for this, but I can speculate. This is the period of time when PCs and PC compatibles have widely spread. IBM has kind of lost its capability to maintain the standards of the platform. You know, VGA was IBM's, as was EGA and CGA before it. Those were graphical standards created by IBM. SVGA was not created by IBM because IBM's losing control of its ability to create standards. As the PC market expands, there's also a hugely expanding market for add-on boards and cards as well. So what happened, I believe, even though I haven't researched this fully, is basically people wanted to move beyond VGA. All of these different companies that were creating PC compatibles or upgrade boards or whatever else were like, we are going to race each other to come up with the biggest, bestest system to move beyond VGA graphics. So every company was implementing Super VGA in its own special way. It was kind of like printers. You know printers, Jeffrey. You've worked with printers before.
My therapist has told me not to discuss that topic.
But it's the same idea as what had happened in printers, which is basically every printer is different. Every Super VGA card is different. So if you want to make use of the capabilities of a particular Super VGA card, you have to write a driver specifically for that card.
So we get into the fun lands of driver nightmares.
Exactly. There was an attempt to solve this problem. There was a standards organization, the Video Electronics Standards Association, or VESA, VESA, that did get together in, I believe, 1989, somewhere thereabouts, and created a VESA standard for SVGA. I remember when that VESA thing used to be a big deal, tangent, but I remember when, you would buy a new monitor or something, and that monitor would advertise very proudly, VESA compliant or something to that effect.
Very similar to how these days it's like HDMI 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, whatever .0.
Yeah. VESA was able to standardize some parts of SVGA, but they weren't able to standardize everything. First of all, they standardized at a particular level. I mean, I don't know exactly what that level was. They standardized at a, kind of least common denominator, which meant that even though anything adhering to that standard would be able to do basic things with SVGA without having to create special drivers for every last card, if your SVGA card went above and beyond that least common denominator, then the VESA standard would not support that. So you would get some of the benefits of SVGA, but you would not get all of the benefits of SVGA without customized drivers. The other thing is that early implementations of VESA did not support page flipping or linear memory access, both of which were incredibly important for creating fast graphics. SVGA kind of existed in a standardized form, but it was at a lowest common denominator kind of implementation, and it was still slow. So it wasn't optimal for games. You were still, if you were a games company, stuck with basically having to create custom drivers for every last SVGA card. I mean, maybe, you could more easily now get 640 by 480 graphics. It wasn't so hard at this point to get your game running 640 by 480. But going above 640 by 480 and 800 by 600, 1024 by 768, better color depth, etc., was still basically going to be a non-starter. And so games in general were not moving over to SVGA in the early 1990s, even though it existed, because standards were a mess. Enter a little operating system by the name of Windows 95.
Good old Windows 95. A step up from Windows 3.1, but a far cry from Windows 10.
Indeed. This is not an episode on Windows 95. I haven't done enough research on it, but someday that would actually be a great thing to do an episode on, because it was transformational for games. We won't go into all of the ways that Windows 95 revolutionized games, but there are two things that are very important. First of all, memory management. It took care of that shit for you and allowed you to very easily access virtual memory and break that 640K barrier.
So I didn't have to drop down to DOS with a special autoexec.bat in order to free up virtual memory.
Exactly. You could technically get beyond the 640K barrier in DOS, but it involved all sorts of extended and expanded and other types of memory and making so many boot disks and then checking the mem manager to see how much is free after every iteration of editing the autoexec pattern config sys. Oh, those were not the days, Jeffrey, but somehow we lived through them.
That's how we were able to actually play games back then, and anyone of our generation who had to go through the fun of trying to play a game had to go through this kind of thing to some extent or another.
Exactly, but Windows 95 had built-in memory management that took care of all of this nonsense, and so never as an end user had to worry about that ever again. The computer just made use of the memory you had, as long as the programs you were using also were written in a way to take advantage of it all, of course, but that all was put on that end instead of on the user's end. So that's one important thing that it did. The other very important thing that it did is it shipped soon after with the DirectX suite of application programming interfaces.
Why would we care about DirectX, Alex? It just goes directly to X. That sounds like math.
Yes. So tell the people a little bit about, we've done this before in other episodes, but it's important to this episode as well. And not everyone's been crazy enough to listen to all 200 plus episodes. So Jeffrey, tell the people a little bit about application programming interfaces and what it means for you, the user, when it comes to activating the hardware in your PC.
Well, DirectX in particular, which is what we're trying to focus in on, is a suite of tools, an API to an extent, that lets you talk to hardware at a base sane level. I want to play a sound. I want to display a box. I want to get input from a keyboard, a mouse, a joystick, whatever. It provides a standardized way for me, the game maker, or someone making code, to interface with all of that in order to do the thing I want to do. I don't have to worry about which IRQ is open in order to allow my hardware to work. I have to code some sort of special interface between the Audigy sound card, the Sound Blaster sound card, the AbLib sound card, and whatever other sound card that is over there, and try to make my generic one work. I don't have to worry about that at all. What DirectX provides is says, hey, we will worry about talking to the hardware for you. It'll put the onus on the hardware developers to create a driver that interfaces with Windows. Windows will be the middleman who will use DirectX to have you, the game developer, talk to Windows and say, I want to display this stuff, I want to display these sounds, I want this input schema. Then Windows will translate that happily over to the hardware so that you actually get the pretty box and you get the pretty sounds. And you take in the input.
Exactly.
DirectX started off having a lot of issues, bugs, craziness, but it really is where it is really where gaming needed to go to get some sort of standardization, because putting the onus on the game developers to create individual drivers for hardware and constantly having to support that was not a tenable situation.
Mm-hmm.
Being able to have a standardized interface, just like what we said with the video cards, with the sound cards, that is so crucial in order to just get past the hurdle of, I don't need to be spending 75% of my development figuring out how to get a box on the screen to show up, play a sound whenever the player presses the space bar to jump. I want to spend that 75% of my time developing the game and only 25% of my time worrying about interfacing with everything. DirectX really, really solved that. Arguably, it finally really hit its stride, sort of like with almost everything Microsoft does, in about its third generation. Around DirectX 3 is when it really took off. At least that's where I really noticed a lot of video games really taking advantage of it.
Absolutely. Wouldn't you know, DirectX 3 was releasing in 1996 right about at the same time that a little company called BioWare was trying to figure out how to create a little engine for their little game Battleground Infinity. It's kind of funny. The team at BioWare were led to DirectX entirely by their inexperience as game makers. I think this is probably one of the reasons that they were moving in this direction at a time when a lot of other companies weren't. It took a while for games to really start appearing with regularity on Windows 95. DOS games still persisted for a decent amount of time. I mean, you could start them up in Windows 95, but they weren't actually taking advantage of any of the functionality within Windows 95, including DirectX. Windows 95 versions took a while to catch on. But here in the beginning of 1996, as Scott is messing around with this engine, he's messing around with the graphics portion of it. And at first, he's doing it the same way that these 2D graphics have been done since time immemorial, since Ultima. Tile-based graphics. We don't need to do a big treatise on tile-based graphics. We talk about them in our Ultima episode, but long story medium is that due to memory constraints that we talked about on these early computer platforms, it was not feasible to create an entire overworld made up of a completely unique drawing where every last part of it is hand-drawn and uniquely crafted. Memory wouldn't make it. So you would create interchangeable tiles that would have different features on them that you could then put together kind of like a puzzle in various ways, and that would create your overworld in a way that was more efficient from a memory perspective. Scott's doing that at the start of working on the Infinity engine because that's what everybody does. The artists that he was working with were bad at it. None of these people were used to video games. They couldn't wrap their heads around the idea of doing tile-based graphics. As a result, Scott decides to start experimenting with Direct Draw, which is one of the components, because DirectX is actually a series of APIs, and that's where that name comes from, because it's direct this, direct that, direct the other thing, so it's DirectX, with X being insert word here. He starts fooling around with Direct Draw, which is the 2D, doesn't do 3D, but the 2D graphics functionality of DirectX that basically allows you to work in the SVGA ecosystem without having to jump through all the hoops of specialized drivers for every last video card on the market. What he discovered once he started playing around with the Direct Draw, just basic demo and tools put out by Microsoft, is that he could suddenly put in these huge screens. These huge scrollable backgrounds, bigger than the size of the screen, scroll around them, that he would create in Photoshop. He could create a big old picture in Photoshop and then import that with Direct 3D and have a huge, colorful, because it's more than 256 colors, detailed, because you can do it at a higher resolution, background graphic that is entirely hand-drawn, bespoke, and unique, and is very large, so large that it takes up more than the screen and you can scroll around. This is a revelation. This is just not how games are made at the time. Generally speaking, like I said, I won't say that no one ever did it before. We're not doing firsts, we're doing popularizers. But this is the kind of thing that was generally not done. It allowed them to create huge, beautiful worlds of a type that nobody else was creating at the time. Because remember, we're talking not even 1998 when Baldur's Gate finally came out. We're talking 1996 because this thing was in development for a very long time. This unlocked the technical side of the game in a fundamental way that created a huge paradigm shift into what RPG worlds could be. Unfortunately, they were having real problems coming up with a story and gameplay systems that would justify the use of this gorgeous engine, this Infinity engine that they've created. They have this idea for this game, Battleground Infinity, but the game is just not coming together. Nevertheless, they start shopping it around. They have the engine kind of in a prototype state. I mean, it's nowhere near finished. They have an engine, they have a gameplay concept, and they start shopping it around. Of course, one of the places that they take it to is the publisher of their previous game, Shattered Steel Interplay. Interplay in this period of time is just about to double down on the RPG genre. I mean, RPGs have always been in Interplay's DNA, going back to the Bard's Tale and Wasteland and all of that stuff in the 80s, but they're really planning to start doubling down, and they're just in the process of forming a new division called Black Isle. So this would seem to be a match made in heaven.
Should be, yes.
Like, they've already worked with each other, so the BioWare people already know the Interplay people. The Interplay people love RPGs. BioWare has an RPG. This is great, right? On top of all of that, Interplay has just secured the Dungeons & Dragons license, which would potentially solve some of the story and world building and gameplay problems that the BioWare people are having. This sounds great. There's just one problem, and that's, Interplay, yeah, they're doubling down on RPGs, which means they already have some RPGs in development, and they're not in the market for any more. They basically pass on it sight unseen. They're shopping it around to other companies, and one of the other companies that they shop it around to is another company in Orange County, same as Interplay, called Virgin Interactive, which, of course, we've talked about before in the context of Seventh Guest particularly. Virgin Interactive is so impressed by this thing that they decide to fly in some of their top brass from Europe because, as we've discussed in the Seventh Guest episode, Virgin is a British company that has an American branch. Some of their brass from Europe are going to come in to view it. When Fergus Urquhart, the head of Black Isle, or the producer that will soon become the head of Black Isle, timeline's a little fuzzy here, hears about that, he's like, oh, wait, does this mean you actually have something impressive? So then he finally takes a look at it and is like, okay, this is actually pretty good. We've got our D&D license. Why don't we do this together? And we'll publish your game and you can use our D&D license. So that match made in heaven comes to pass, even though it was a very near miss. Now they've got the D&D license from TSR. It is still TSR at this point. So they're like, great. Now we can use the D&D rules, and we can use their characters, and we'll do this in the Forgotten Realms, which is at this time one of their most popular settings. We can use some of their big characters, like Drizzt and Elminster, and all of that. This will be lots of fun. Well, TSR is fine with letting them use the license and, hook them up with all sorts of second edition, because that's what was out there at the time, all sorts of second edition AD&D rule books and supplements and whatnot to help them get going. But on the topic of using their big characters, no, guys, not so much, because you're this small little startup that really hasn't done anything, and Drizzt appears in New York Times best-selling novels, and we're not trusting our biggest and baddest characters to y'all. Like, yeah, use the Forgotten Realms setting, sure, but you're not going to be, have access to our core characters. They have to come up with their own. But this isn't really that bad a thing, because it just so happens that they have an expert on all of this already in-house by the name of James Olin. James Olin was a young guy just out of school, and that school being the Grand Prairie Regional College, who was not much of a video game guy. Didn't play many video games, wasn't a huge fan of video games, certainly had no aspirations to work in video games, but was a serial dungeon master. He started running games in high school. He continued to run them at Grand Prairie Regional College. At one time at the college, he was running 3 different games concurrently with different sets of players.
That's impressive.
Yep. Did his signature campaign in the Forgotten Realms campaign setting, so was very, very familiar with that setting. When he got out of school, he opened a comic book shop, because he was that kind of nerd, just in time for the infamous comics bubble to burst in the mid-1990s. That's a whole nother topic, but basically there'd been a lot of speculation in the comics market, a lot of releasing number ones all of the time and putting out tons of them for the collector's market and collectors buying them, hoping that they'd appreciate in value, and then they didn't. I mean, it's a bubble, just like any bubble. Just in time for that bubble to collapse. Meanwhile, one of his friends, a programmer named Cameron Topher, who also played in his D&D campaign as a character named Minsk, yes, that Minsk, got himself and some of their other friends jobs at BioWare, which was hiring up to work on this new game. So Cam asked James if he'd like to come along. Yeah, I mean, video games had never really been his thing, but he knew they were working on an RPG. He was going to be a designer. He didn't have to program or anything. So he decided, sure, to come along with this whole group of people from Grand Prairie Regional College that were all hired into BioWare at once, about a half dozen of them, with Topher and Olin being the most important ones to our specific story here. When using any established Forgotten Realms characters fell through, Olin just turned to all of the characters that he and his friends had created in his D&D campaigns going all the way back to high school set in the Forgotten Realms, which included characters like Minsk, Saravok, who was the main villain of the first game, John Irenicus, who was the main villain of the second game, Zan, I think Edwin was another one, like many, many, many of the characters, good and bad, that were found in the first two Baldur's Gate games were characters that came out of these campaigns and had been played by real people in those campaigns.
Everyone's great dream, having their D&D games become a live video game that other people can enjoy.
Exactly. So that's how they got the characters. For the setting, why Baldur's Gate, you had asked? Well, they wanted a part of the Forgotten Realms that was less covered. Now, there'd been supplements on the Sword Coast and on Baldur's Gate, particularly Volo's Guide to the Sword Coast, but the vast majority of campaign material in the Forgotten Realms was focused on the so-called Heartlands, where the nation of Cormyr and the Dale Lands and some of these other places were, or on the North, which was kind of their take on a more Conan-style Hyperborean northern adventure. Those were kind of the two main areas they focused on. There are a lot of regions. The Forgotten Realms is huge. Many of those regions are a little more alien. They're less mainstream swords and sorceries based on Near Eastern cultures or that kind of thing. So they wanted to keep it in something in familiar medieval sword and sorcery, but they wanted to stay away from the areas that had been super heavily developed because that would give them less leeway to make their own stories in. So they chose the Sword Coast and the city of Baldur's Gate, specifically because it was still within a very traditional D&D milieu, but was not overly developed, so they had lots of room to play. That was the setting that they picked. Now, when it came to story, they wanted to have kind of a big, more serious, overarching plot. They felt a lot of RPGs had pretty trite plots. They wanted something that felt a little more serious. So they hit upon the idea of a political plot involving the kind of evil merchant group in the Forgotten Realms. This is something that was already established. They didn't invent it, called the Iron Throne. And in fact, the name of the game was going to be Iron Throne, which hits completely differently now after, Game of Thrones blew up in a huge, huge way. The Iron Throne being the seat of power in the Kingdom of Westeros and becoming a pop culture icon. But back then, references to thrones were more likely to be taken less seriously and revolve around bathrooms than around really serious political plots. And so they did, near the end, decide to change the name from Iron Throne to Baldur's Gate. Not chosen for any other reason than a good chunk of the game takes place there, and no one's going to make potty humor about it, as they might with Iron Throne. They created this overall, political story about the Iron Throne, and then, of course, layered in with some Bale spawn god stuff. They wanted to have that more serious plot, but they didn't really feel that that was the essence of D&D. The essence of D&D, plots are good, world building's good. All of this stuff is good in an RPG. But the essence of D&D, still to this day, is a bunch of friends getting together around a table and doing the most ridiculous things and creating the most ridiculous characters they can think of and just having fun together being ridiculous.
That's why you go through an abomination vault and have a lich bound to a kitty that is your personal servant.
Indeed. No bonus points for getting that reference because unless you're one of the 5 people in our little campaign, you wouldn't know where to start. But yes, that's why those kind of things. They figured that the real joy of D&D is in the moment-to-moment interactions that you have with your party and that you have with NPCs that are giving you quests and all of these little side quests that you go on in addition to whatever main overarching plot you're trying to solve. They decided to go in that direction as their focus. Olin had these characters that kind of existed, but they weren't fully realized in the way that you would fully realize a character in a novel or video game story or that kind of thing. You know, these are still being played by players, and these players aren't writers, and so they have a trait or two, but they're not fully realized characters. Like Minsk, he was played as a character who had a head wound, who was a little bit off and a little bit out there because of his head wound, and he did have a miniature giant space hamster in the campaign. This was a con, basically. This merchant had offered this hamster to Minsk and called it a miniature giant space hamster, as a con. And Minsk, with the head wound and everything's took it. And then the player, who was Cam Topher, the programmer that worked at BioWare, decided, well, I'm going to lean into this all the way. And it's going to be his animal companion. He's going to talk to it and he's really going to believe that he's having conversations in this space hamster. So some of these characteristics of the characters were established, but they weren't fully fleshed out. So at this point, BioWare did the kind of thing that would continue to make it famous in the future, as we talked about in our Mass Effect episodes. They hired a writer, Luke Christiansen, to actually come in and write up basically all the text in the game. Dialogue, codex entries, journal entries, everything that's going on in the game. He did it, almost all of it himself. As one article puts it, he produced an estimated 70% of the game's 800,000 words, all by himself.
That's a lot of writing.
Yeah. He's the one that created the moment-to-moment interactions between the characters and NPCs, quest dialogue, all of this stuff. And like I said, instead of putting a focus on the big overarching plot, I mean, they did create a big overarching plot, he really focused in on the little and really making the moment-to-moment interactions as interesting as he could, because Olin and Christiansen and all of them thought that was the true essence of D&D, and it's hard to disagree with them on that.
You play off of each other. You have the little funny interactions back and forth of my character does something, another character goes, oh, I like that. I'm going to play off of that and do this other thing and twist it in this other different way, and then you get funny interaction back and forth. It's how we go from a barbarian who happened to roll really, really well on some climb checks.
Yeah.
Inadvertently becomes this pseudo-rogue because he's really, really good at rolling sometimes and does sneaky rogue stuff, even though he's a barbarian.
Exactly. And, Baldur's Gate 2 had way more inter-party banter than the original Baldur's Gate did. They really amped that up as the series went along, but that foundational stuff was there from the beginning. And, not just, of course, the inter-party banter, but also having interesting or ridiculous conversations with NPCs, that kind of thing. They really wanted to focus on that aspect. That's character, that's setting, that's world, that's writing. Of course, the other thing that Baldur's Gate is very famous for is the way it represents the D&D rules in a way that is both largely faithful and also very engaging for a modern being a 1998 modern audience. There are two aspects to that. First of all is that they really wanted to faithfully recreate D&D, or AD&D as it would be at this time. By faithfully recreate, they didn't mean that they wanted to get every last rule right. For instance, they didn't really care about movement rules. They didn't really care about you move X number of feet a turn, etc., etc. But they felt that they had to get certain core things right. They had to get the way weapons worked, the way spells worked, the way certain things worked absolutely perfectly right. And they just wanted everything else to capture the feel of AD&D. They wanted it to always feel authentic, and they wanted it to most of the time actually be authentic. But by being authentic in the areas where it really mattered, they could fudge in the areas that people didn't pay attention to as much, and it would still feel like something that was pretty authentic AD&D. Their main inspiration for what they wanted to do here was the Gold Box series of games, SSI's D&D games at the end of the 1980s, also set in the Forgotten Realms campaign setting, though that part of it's coincidental, because Pools of Radiance and the games that followed it were also doing their best to create an authentic AD&D experience in the way that they did combat and whatnot. So that was their gold standard, ha ha ha. But with a twist. That twist was largely, though everyone was in agreement, it wasn't just him, but was largely the result of James Olin, the lead designer on the game, mostly not liking video games. He was not a big video game guy, but he had really gotten into real-time strategy games. He really liked the Warcraft games. He wasn't the only one. There were other people on the team that did too. I don't want to... A lot of what I've read seems to place Olin driving some of this, but it's very possible that it was all much more collaborative than that amongst the team. Olin was the lead designer, so even though everybody filled in everywhere, like programmers also design things and this, that, and the other, it's not like he's the only person that ever designed something in the game. In some ways, the buck still stops with him, so that's why I'm emphasizing Olin, but it was very collaborative, and other people also shared similar thoughts that were on the team. He really liked those real-time games. He wanted to do this in real time. Of course, real-time interfaces were already being used in it, like the way that RTSs kind of revolutionized using the GUI interface in computer games was being used in Baldur's Gate for character selection and for moving characters around and interacting with things, using a lot of the methods that were developed in games like Dune 2 and Warcraft and Command & Conquer. He also wanted the action to play out in real time, just like these games that he was really liking. That was great and all, except that it very quickly lost the D&D feel because it moves too fast. Everyone's just starting to whack at each other and there's nothing for it. There were some people on the team, more AD&D purists, that wanted something more like the Gold Box, which was very strategic and, of course, was turn-based in its combat. This captures more of the essence of D&D or AD&D in a way, of course, because combat takes place in rounds. It is literally turn-based, but it loses a lot of that visceral immediacy that people like James, as well as many modern game players, really wanted to see in games these days. So as a compromise between these two positions, they, of course, came up with the famous real-time with pause. It's not the first game ever to allow you to issue orders in real time and then pause at moments when you need a moment to think. Not saying they invented it, but they came up with this compromise of real-time with pause so that they could have the fast action coupled with that more D&D feel and the ability to take a moment and plan your actions in the way that you would do in a real tabletop role-playing game. The final thing that I want to come back to again on this, so we've talked about story, setting, character, game systems a little bit, all of this stuff. The final thing that I want to come back to a little bit is the Infinity Engine itself and the fact that Scott, Grieg, however he pronounces his name, terribly sorry, being a database programmer and not a traditional game programmer, and how that came back to really shape this game. As I kind of said before, many of the earlier games out there, most of the challenge was in just getting your engine to run, just getting your game to work, just getting it fast enough, just getting things to happen was always such a huge challenge. And it's not that they didn't have these challenges in this game as well, because every game has those challenges. But by taking this approach of moving the Infinity Engine into this more API direction with direct draw and in a more structured database direction, they didn't necessarily have to spend as much time figuring out how to make things work, and they could just put lots of things in the game. So Grieg was a database programmer. So he structured a lot of the content within the game as you would structure a database, any other kind of database. I mean, it was a database, but structured it the way you would structure any other kind of database. What this meant is that they spent the majority of their time just creating a ridiculous number of assets and adding them to this database and to this engine that they had constructed. It had so many screens, individual overworld and underworld dungeon screens, all of which were unique, hand-drawn, with vibrant colors and good detail, the likes of which you didn't normally see. They put tons of characters in the database and tons of sounds and music and weapons and armor and items. They stuffed it with more, which they were able to more easily do because of the structure and discipline around their Infinity engine. It was just a huge game as a result of that. You really had all the ingredients here that you needed for a massive hit and kind of a new kind of RPG that still harkened back to the RPGs of the past. It wasn't a complete break with gold box games or the Ultimas of the world or any of that stuff. It wasn't a complete break from that, but it took it to a new level that would appeal more to the modern gamer. Instead of everything being turn-based, we're real-time with pause. The action feels fast. Real-time strategy players are going to immediately recognize the interface. It's going to feel good. It's going to feel quick. Combat is going to feel really fast and fluid because the rounds are going by so fast that, especially if you're not pausing, you barely even notice that they're happening. It has that real-time feel that modern games need. It has graphics beyond anything seen in similar RPGs before. The public is becoming more graphic conscious. You know, it's just a gorgeous game because they're taking advantage of features of DirectX and Windows 95 that, to this point, are still rarely being taken advantage of by most companies. And then they're capturing moment-to-moment interactions that are just very interesting and keeps you wanting to discover new companions and run around with new companions and discover new side quests and hit every last corner of this world, just the same way that a good DM keeps the players engaged with moment-to-moment interactions and gameplay. You know, they're not just focused on this big epic quest. They're like, here's an interesting moment here, here's an interesting moment here, here's a fascinating character here. They're giving you these little things along the way. When you put that all together, you just get an RPG that appeals more to a modern audience while still, through its faithfulness to the mechanics of D&D, of AD&D at the time, and all of this kind of crunchy RPG stuff going on beneath the surface, you're still also bringing along your hardcore audience. You're just getting an audience expansion out of this instead of shifting to a different audience. You're bringing everybody in. The game was not expected to be that big a hit. Interplay had very conservative sales figure projections for it because RPGs had been in such decline in the United States. They thought maybe they'd reach 100,000 lifetime units, which, you know, is fine. But by the late 1990s isn't exactly a massive hit. That would have been a massive hit in 1988. It's not so much a massive hit in 1998, though it would have made money. It wouldn't have been a failure either. Within 2 weeks, it moved 175,000 units. It was released in December. By February, 2 months later, 500,000 units. It had a good tail. You know, it kept selling in some quantities after that. So by May of 2001, they'd hit 1.5 million units. Just unheard of numbers for a more traditional RPG of this type. As I said, it kind of combined the best of the old school crunchy RPGs like the Gold Box series with some of the new styles of graphics and gameplay coming out of the more advanced games in the 1990s. And so it became a crossover hit. It put BioWare on the map. It played a large role in the revival of this Western RPG market, which was in pretty bad shape. Even if it wasn't as dead as some sources like to make it, even if the blobbers were still clinging to life a little bit in Europe, or games like Fallout or Diablo, which was not really classified as an RPG at the time, were still doing some business. This is the game that convinced people that the more traditional Western RPG was here to stay.
And all it took was 3 doctors, a database programmer, and a DM.
Exactly.
I almost don't want to leave this. I mean, it took so long to get here. And yet here we are in Baldur's Gate. I'm enjoying my sit here at the tavern here, listening to the story. Yes, another round for us, please. Thank you. Really, I don't want to leave. Unless I were to send a mob after you to talk about Baldur's Gate 2, unfortunately, there's not a lot left for us to go over here. We've really covered a lot of where the game came from, the origins from BioWare, the creation of it, a lot of the systems that went into it, why it's called Baldur's Gate, where the Infinity Engine came from. There's a lot of stuff there. All the characters, all the beloved characters like Minsk and Boo and adventuring together.
Indeed.
I guess if we're going to have to leave, Alex, where are we going?
Well, Jeffrey, I think it is time to leave Baldur's Gate, as you said. I think we should get in our Ferrari Testarossa with our best girl at our side and magical sound shower on the radio, hit the road for parts further east, and explore the legendary career of Sega's Yu Suzuki. Known in his early career for some of the most important arcade hits of the 1980s, like Hang On, Outrun, and Space Harrier, and later developing a dedicated cult following with his Dreamcast game Shenmue.
All right, I guess we'll just go through the gate into the car. Or do we just bring the car through the gate and then get in and then go? I'm not sure how that works. But who knows? Next time on They Create Worlds, we get to talk about something from Sega, and I know all of you like that one. So we'll see you then. Bye-bye. Check out our show notes at podcast.theycreateworlds.com, where we have links to some of the things we discuss in this and other episodes. You can check out Alex's video game history blog at videogamehistorian.wordpress.com. Alex's book, They Create Worlds, the story of the people and companies that shaped the video game industry, Volume 1, can now be ordered through CRC Press and at major online retailers. Feel free to email us at feedback@theycreateworlds.com. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/theycreateworlds. If you do sign up, please do so through the website and not the iOS app. This saves you from the 30% Apple markup. We understand that you may not be able to financially support us, but you can still support us by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or the podcasting service that you use. We now have the podcast available on YouTube. Please like and subscribe. Intro music is Airplane Mode by Josh Woodward, found at joshwoodward.com/song/airplane mode, used under a Creative Commons Attribution License. Outro music is Bacterial Love by Roll Music, found at freemusicarchive.org, used under a Creative Commons Attribution License.
God, where are we going? We better figure that out. We need to tell the people.
Yeah.